In public, Neil was able to mask his grief as adults are expected to, but in the privacy of his apartment, the floodgates of emotion burst open. The awareness of Sarah's absence would overwhelm him, and then he'd collapse on the floor and weep. He'd curl up into a ball, his body racked by hiccuping sobs, tears and mucus streaming down his face, the anguish coming in ever increasing waves until it was more than he could bear, more intense than he'd have believed possible. Minutes or hours later, it would leave, and he would fall asleep exhausted. And the next morning, he would wake up and face the prospect of another day without Sarah. An elderly woman in Neil's apartment building tried to comfort him by telling him that the pain would lessen in time, and while he would never forget his wife, he would at least be able to move on. Then he would meet someone else one day and find happiness with her, and he would learn to love God and thus ascend to heaven when his time came. This woman's intentions were good, but Neil was in no position to find any comfort in her words. Sarah's absence felt like an open wound, and the prospect that someday he would no longer feel pain at her loss seemed not just remote, but a physical impossibility. If suicide would have ended his pain, he'd have done it without hesitation, but that would only ensure that his separation from Sarah was permanent. The topic of suicide regularly came up at the support group meetings, and inevitably led to someone mentioning Robin Pearson, a woman who used to come to the meetings several months before Neil began attending. Robin's husband had been afflicted with stomach cancer during a visitation by the angel Macatiel. She stayed in his hospital room for days at a stretch, only for him to die unexpectedly when she was home doing laundry. A nurse who'd been present told Robin that his soul had ascended, and so Robin had begun attending the support group meetings. Many months later, Robin came to the meeting shaking with rage. There'd been a manifestation of hell near her house, and she'd seen her husband among the lost souls. She'd confronted the nurse, who admitted to lying in the hopes that Robin would learn to love God, so that at least she would be saved even if her husband hadn't been. Robin wasn't at the next meeting, and at the meeting after that, the group learned she had committed suicide to rejoin her husband. None of them knew the status of Robin's and her husband's relationship in the afterlife, but successes were known to happen. Some couples had indeed been happily reunited through suicide. The support group had attendees whose spouses had descended to hell, and they talked about being torn between wanting to remain alive and wanting to rejoin their spouses. Neil wasn't in their situation, but his first response when listening to them had been envy. If Sarah had gone to hell, suicide would be the solution to all his problems. This led to a shameful self-knowledge for Neil. He realized that if he had to choose between going to hell while Sarah went to heaven, or having both of them go to hell together, he would choose the latter. He would rather she be exiled from God than separated from him. He knew it was selfish, but he couldn't change how he felt. He believed Sarah could be happy in either place, but he could only be happy with her. Neil's previous experiences with women had never been good. All too often, he'd begin flirting with a woman while sitting at a bar, only to have her remember an appointment elsewhere the moment he stood up and his shortened leg came into view. Once, a woman he'd been dating for several weeks broke off their relationship, explaining that while she herself didn't consider his leg a defect, whenever they were seen in public together, other people assumed There must be something wrong with her for being with him, and surely he could understand how unfair that was to her. Sarah had been the first woman Neil met whose demeanor hadn't changed one bit, whose expression hadn't flickered toward pity or horror, or even surprise when she first saw his leg. For that reason alone, it was predictable that Neil would become infatuated with her. By the time he saw all sides of her personality, he'd completely fallen in love with her. And because his best qualities came out when he was with her, she fell in love with him too. Neil had been surprised when Sarah told him she was devout. There weren't many signs of her devotion. She didn't go to church, sharing Neil's dislike for the attitudes of most people who attended, but in her own, quiet way she was grateful to God for her life. She never tried to convert Neil, saying that devotion would come from within or not at all. They rarely had any cause to mention God, and most of the time it would have been easy for Neil to imagine that Sarah's views on God matched his own. This is not to say Sarah's devotion had no effect on Neil. On the contrary, Sarah was far and away the best argument for loving God that he had never encountered. If love of God had contributed to making her the person she was, then perhaps it did make sense. During the years that the two of them were married, his outlook on life improved, and it probably would have reached the point where he was thankful to God if he and Sarah had grown old together. Sarah's death removed that particular possibility, but it didn't have closed the door on Neil's loving God. Neil could have taken it as a reminder that no one can count on having decades left. He could have been moved by the realization that, had he died with her, his soul would have been lost and the two of them separated for eternity. He could have seen Sarah's death as a wake-up call, telling him to love God while he still had the chance. Instead, Neil became actively resentful of God. Sarah had been the greatest blessing of his life, and God had taken her away. Now he was expected to love him for it. For Neil, it was like having a kidnapper demand love as ransom for his wife's return. Obedience he might have managed, but sincere, heartfelt love, that was a ransom he couldn't pay. This paradox confronted several people in the support group. One of the attendees, a man named Phil Soames, correctly pointed out that thinking of it as a condition to be met would guarantee failure. You couldn't love God as a means to an end, you had to love Him for Himself. And your ultimate goal in loving God was a reunion with your spouse. You weren't demonstrating true devotion at all. A woman in the support group named Valerie Tomasino said they shouldn't even try. She'd been reading a book published by the humanist movement. Its members considered it wrong to love a God who inflicted such pain and advocated that people act according to their own moral sense instead of being guided by the carrot and the stick. These were people who, when they died, descended to hell in proud defiance of God. Neil himself had read a pamphlet of the humanist movement. What he most remembered was that it had quoted the fallen angels. Visitations of fallen angels were infrequent, and caused neither good fortune nor bad. They weren't acting under God's direction, but just passing through the mortal plane as they went about their unimaginable business. On the occasions they appeared, people would ask them questions. Did they know God's intentions? Why had they rebelled? The fallen angels' reply was always the same. Decide for yourselves. And that is what we did. We advise you to do the same. Those in the humanist movement had decided, and if it weren't for Sarah, Neil would have made the identical choice. But he wanted her back, and the only way was to find a reason to love God. Looking for any footing on which to build their devotion, some attendees of the support group took comfort in the fact that their loved ones hadn't suffered when God took him, but instead died instantly. Neil didn't even have that. Sarah had received horrific lacerations when the glass hit her. Of course, it could have been worse. One couple's teenage son had been trapped in a fire ignited by an angel's visitation and received full-thickness burns over 80% of his body before rescue workers could free him. His eventual death was a mercy. Sarah had been fortunate by comparison, but not enough to make Neil love God. Neil could think of only one thing that would make him give thanks to God, and that was if he allowed Sarah to appear before him. It would give him immeasurable comfort just to see her smile again. He had never been visited by a saved soul before, and a vision now would have meant more to him than at any other point in his life. But visions don't appear just because a person needs one, and none ever came to Neil. He had to find his own way toward God. The next time he attended the support group meeting for witnesses of Nathaniel's visitation, Neil sought out Benny Vasquez, the man whose eyes had been erased by heaven's light. Benny didn't always attend because he was now being invited to speak at other meetings. Few visitations resulted in an eyeless person, since heaven's light entered the mortal plane only if the brief moments that an angel emerged from or re-entered heaven, so the eyeless were minor celebrities and in demand as speakers to church groups. Benny now as sightless as any burrowing worm, and not only were his eyes and sockets missing, his skull lacked even the space for such features, the cheekbones now abutting the forehead. The light that had brought his soul as close to perfection as was possible in the mortal plane had so deformed his body. It was commonly held that this illustrated the superfluity of physical bodies in heaven. With the limited expressive capacity his face retained, Benny always wore a blissful, rapturous smile.